Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are going to finish what we started about 5 weeks ago, I think it is now, on equipment. And at the time, excuse me, not a good start. At the time, we did say we were going to manage 6 topics, and we got through half of them. We got through lying, sitting, and standing. So we still have mobility, which is a very big topic, home equipment, and school or work equipment. Now, school work at the moment, I think, to be honest, a lot of people are working from home, and I think at school you're probably putting up with a lot of last year's equipment that no longer fits because there's no OTs and physios being allowed into school to change things. So on the whole, we're going to start with home because I think we can manage that quite quickly, and then spend quite a lot of time on mobility, because mobility is every possible way of getting from A to B. So if we start with home, you may think, well, what's that got to do with a physiotherapist? Surely this is all OT. And you would be quite right. In most circumstances, it is OTs who would be doing home equipment. But the reason that tonight it's me is because in our team at Great Ormond Street, I have now been doing this 31 years. We have never had an OT to help. And that was not necessarily my choice, but we never were funded for an OT. So we have had to learn over the years all the different things that you would need at home, how to look after yourselves and your children in terms of equipment and access. So I do have a reasonable idea. As I said at the beginning of last time's talk, if you really have any questions that you feel your OT cannot or is not answering, then you can go to dlf.org.uk, the Disabled Living Foundation. It is a charity. They will give you unbiased information. dlf.org.uk are an amazing source of information. If you are in the right place at the right time, you can get to something called NAIDEX, but of course with lockdown you can't. And NAIDEX is National AIDS for the Disabled exhibition. It usually happens in Birmingham at the NEC. It sometimes is a Northern NAIDEX in Manchester, and occasionally they have a Scottish NAIDEX up in Glasgow. I have no idea when the next NAIDEX will be held, because of course at the moment all these things are banned. So unfortunately we do have to stick to the internet. We have to stick to those places we know that we're going to get the right information. And there is too much information out there because very often it conflicts. But if we start about thinking about what's going on in home and what are the major issues. And the major issues at home are first and foremost and always access into the building. Do you have steps to get there? Because if you do, you need to think about getting wheelchairs in, and particularly electric wheelchairs in, because most wheelchair services, when we come to mobility, will not allow you to have an electric wheelchair until the house is accessible. So we need to think about getting into the house. We need to think about, once in the house, can we get around? We need to think about safety. We need to think about stairs. We need to think about long-term, irrespective of treatments. We need to be realistic, and we need to think about all the equipment, particularly for independence and what we call ADL, activities of daily living. Now, it goes without saying that most young individuals, old individuals with SMA are clever at most things. And it is not fun to be a child, a teenager, or an adult and know that somebody else has to do absolutely everything for you, or certainly help with a lot of activities of daily living. And while we can't get away from the fact that we do need help, we also want to be as independent as possible in those things we can be. There are some people who can live by themselves, but on the whole, if you are not ambulant, it is very, very difficult to be independent. But if you can be independent in more and more things, if you can do more things for yourself, And not only do you have to not rely on help, you don't have to wait for help. If you could turn yourself in bed, you know that you wouldn't have to wake somebody else up. If you know that you didn't have to ask for help getting in and out of baths or getting on and off shower chairs, it becomes impossible. You know that you are going to need that help. But what we need to do is be safe. We need lots of thought on safety. And one of the biggest areas when it comes to safety are stairs, getting up and down stairs and how we manage that. So let's first think about access into your building. If we start at the front of the house, it may be in some cases the back is more accessible than the front, but you also have to think about how you get around the back to access that. You have to think about the fire situation when you're thinking of access. And the first thing you need to think about is either ramps or making a door accessible for a wheelchair. Now, many of you have started off in properties that either weren't suitable for wheelchairs or needed adaptations. But don't leave these things too late. If you haven't thought about them, think about them. Better to have the adaptations and not need them. That's the same with wheelchairs, than not have them and need them. So we've managed to get into the house, and now we have to think about the safety around the house. Is the house accessible? Do you have narrow corridors that will not take an electric wheelchair to turn? Do we have to think about removing doors? Do we have to think about rooms that will and will not be accessible? Do we even have to think about the flooring? What is on the floor? What will an electric wheelchair mangle in terms of carpet? What surfaces are safe if you have a child that's walking? You really don't want stone or concrete floors for a little child type 3 who may be falling. So all the different things we need to think about, and you almost need to do it room by room. But one of the biggest headaches when it comes to home, apart from stairs, is bathroom toilet. Is the toilet big enough to get a wheelchair in? Is the bathroom and toilet combined, and is there space in that to get a wheelchair in? And if you've got the wheelchair in, is there space then to get the child, the young adult, the adult from the wheelchair onto the toilet into the bath? And anticipation is part of the problem. If we leave it until things get awful, until everybody is struggling and things get really bad, then life becomes extremely difficult. So as I say, when it comes to houses, when it comes to equipment, when it comes to adaptations, I know there is a lot of red tape. I know you can wait these days forever for an OT to come around because of lockdown, but we need to think about parents, carers, and the children. We know there are budgets. We know there are financial situations that make life difficult. We know people who were planning to move and have been made redundant. But we need help, and we need local authorities to be aware that you need help. And if you need lots of help and you are not getting it, you can ask for a social worker. Now, one of the problems with people is they don't want to ask for a social worker because that somehow means that you have failed, that you're not a good parent, that there is a negative connotation around social work. But don't feel that way. Within social work, there are lots of different jobs, and one of them is family advisors and family care. And they are there to help you sort out the maze of benefits, of grants, of loans, of battles, and they can help you, at least signpoint you in the right direction of help. So if you're battling with your local authority, if you're battling with your local OT in social services, if things are getting very difficult, do not be afraid to try and find yourself a social worker. If that becomes a problem, the other people that you can contact are MD UK, who have family care officers around the country, And MD UK may be able to signpost you, if not help you directly, when it comes to the problems of home and home adaptations. There was a time when MD UK used to employ their own OTs. This is unfortunately a long time ago, but they had two very good OTs. They had one lady, Philippa Harbin, that was longer ago than most of you have been alive. And then they had two other OTs, but they stopped employing their own OTs, which was a shame because these OTs knew so much about SMA and could help other OTs and other physios with equipment, as well as obviously parents and carers. But MD UK still have quite a lot of information. They still have quite a lot of information on building and looking at if you need to get an architect, they can help with plans and good sizes. They have manuals that look at sizes in terms of turning wheelchairs, in terms of hoisting, in terms of ceiling track hoists, all this sort of thing they have advice on. So MD UK is another place that you can ask for help. You need to think about stairs. And while most situations you will either need a through floor lift or downstairs or level accommodation, there are some OTs who will offer you a stair lift, particularly for some of the type 3s who are struggling with stairs. And my recommendation with stair lifts is, if you can possibly avoid them, do, because they can only be temporary for someone who is struggling and deteriorating. With the new treatments, if you have a type 3 who is struggling with stairs but can still walk quite well, then a stair lift may be a good option because it can get them up and down the stairs, and that will take away the barrier. But if you have a child who really is not walking very well, or an adult who is finding very difficult both to walk and do stairs, then a stair lift doesn't really solve the problems. And if you have to lift someone on at the bottom and then struggle to walk at the top, you may need a wheelchair at the top as well. Are you then going to have to get around in a shower chair? Not an easy option when you get to the top of the stairs. So you need to think long term. Stair lifts are great for type 3s who just struggle with stairs, but walking is not a problem. But otherwise, stair lifts are not an option. One of the big problems that a lot of parents complain about, they don't hoist because the hoist will not go into the bathroom or the toilet. Or what you end up with is you hoist in and out of the bath, but then you have to take a dripping wet and cold child or even young person, adult, from the bathroom into another room. And that's a really difficult situation, particularly in the winter. So we also need to think about accessible bathrooms and toilets. And many people say to me, they like going in the bath. They enjoy a bath in the winter when they're cold. They love wallowing in the bath. They can do exercises in the bath. And the OTs come along and they suggest a wet room without a bath. And people get a little bit upset about it. They want a bath. And sometimes you have to accept that you just can't have everything. But often it's much easier to have a bath if you have level access living. So if you're in a bungalow or a ground floor flat, or you are able to have an extension with an ensuite, then you are more likely to have the space for a bathroom in the bathroom than just a shower with wheel-in shower chair. So you have to think about what works for your family, what works for the property you're in, or whether you need to move. You have to think safety, you have to think fire, you have to think about manual handling and lifting. A bath is great if you have a hoist, but we know so many situations where in the bathroom you have to lift what can be a fairly big child into a bath and out of a bath. And that is a big strain on anybody's back. You may be given a bath seat, which is fine, but if the bath seat sits at the bottom of the bath and that helps the child sit in the bath, well, that's all very well, but you still have to lift them into it and lift them out of it. So you haven't really solved any problems with a bath seat unless it is one that lowers into the bath and then raises you back out of the bath. And that's what really you should be having. There are also the pump up versions by Mangar, which will lift you in the seat up in the bath. And if you have a type 3 who is falling, particularly an adult, before any adaptations can be made and we are struggling to get this adult or older child off the floor, then you may find something like a Mangar Elk, which pumps up. It's an inflatable piece of equipment. It goes on the floor. You manage to get yourself on it, or somebody gets you on it to sit, and then it pumps you up onto the level of another chair or into standing. So there are many, many pieces of equipment. And what I think it's easiest to do is either contact the DLF and ask them for all these pieces of equipment if you haven't thought about them, or contact your OT or social services OT just for information if they haven't given it to you. If you haven't got any adaptations yet, if you're thinking about them, then get all the information that you can think of first. Think about every room in the house. Think about whether it's going to have to be accessible for your child. Think about accessing at the front, but also if you have a garden, then think about access into the garden, because it's a little unfair to have a garden that you can't get a wheelchair around, or you can only get round part, or you can only get onto the first bit of the patio while everybody else is playing at the other end. So when you're talking about home adaptations, equipment, think every room in the house. Does this need to be accessible? What equipment do I need at home? How is life going to be made easier? How is the kitchen going to be better if you want that person to have access to the kitchen? And we'll talk about wheelchairs with raising, lowering seats when we come to mobility, because it really is, to me, one of the most important features of an electric wheelchair. So Marnie, any questions on home? Otherwise, we're going to tackle that great big topic of mobility.
We've not really got any about home, but we've got some that isn't really mobility either. So do you want me to ask them before we get into mobility?
No, do ask, please.
Yeah. So did ask about vibration plates. Do you recommend
everybody is asking about vibration plates at the moment. Does it say what type of SMA?
No.
That's a problem. Okay, everyone, I think this is the third time in 4 days that I've been asked about vibration plates. There is a study from Germany that says it helps with power. The question is, what are you going to do with it? If you are a type 2 and you want it to help with power, have you identified where you want it to help with power? Are you going to stick it under your feet? Are you going to stick it under your bottom? Are you going to put your hands on it? Vibration by itself will not build muscle. Like with everything, if you want to build muscle, you have to work with it. So you have to be doing a particular exercise where the vibration is challenging you to work harder. So with type 2, it's quite difficult to establish what you want it to achieve. With type 3, it's much easier because standing on a vibration plate is quite challenging. It can affect your balance, it can affect your movement, and it challenges your balance and your movement. Now, I have used vibration plates because when they first came out, they had them at the gym where I used to go, and I started doing some work on them. And to be honest, I hated them. I really didn't find that it made me exercise any better. There are studies, mostly done in Australia, that showed that vibration helps bone health in non-ambulant people. And the reason that it helps bone health is because what makes bone strong is not standing, but vibration. And every time you take a step, you hit the ground with your heel in the normal situation. And the vibration of that, as minute as it is, and we don't notice it, travels all the way up your lower leg, your thigh, into your pelvis, up your spine, and helps your bone health. Now, obviously, if you're on certain medications, if you're non-ambulant, if you're quite static, then you are not getting that vibration. You may stand in a standing frame, but static standing itself, although you get joint compression, which can cause a little bit of vibration around the joints, it's not the same as walking. So what is actually thought is that the vibration of a vibration plate can help bone health. And there are standing frames that are being built into, having vibration plates built into the bottom of the standing frames. And you can't just put it on to shake and hope it'll do some good. As I say, it's better when you're being challenged if you want to build power. You also need to make sure that it is very adjustable, because there are 3 ways of adjusting a power plate. There is intensity, basically how hard it shakes you. And sometimes if it's very intense, it really can be quite unpleasant, particularly if your head control, if your core control, if your hip control is not brilliant, then you can feel like a milkshake when you've finished. So you need intensity. You need to look at the length between the vibrations. Are they stacked together very quickly? Is it a very fine vibration, or is it a bit more of a slower vibration? And you want to be able to change the speed as well as the intensity, because you need to be able to adjust it to suit you. Some people prefer the very intense sort of vibration where it's vibrating quickly, and some prefer a slower vibration, or some you can adjust that they alter, that they start, they're a bit fast and then slower and faster and slower. And then the final thing is, how long are you going to be on it for? And most vibrating plates actually do not go on for very long. You normally get 1 to 2 minutes, then have a break, 1 to 2 minutes, have a break. It's not continuous for ages and ages. And to be honest, there is one other thing you really do need to consider. If you have serious bone health problems, my honest feeling is, if you are quick to fracture, if you have any vertebral collapse, if you have thin bones, if you are known to be osteoporotic, I would get advice from your endocrinologist before you use them on any great intensity. I would be very unhappy if I knew somebody had extremely thin bones and was prone to fracture, that they were using these machines without first consulting an endocrinologist. Most people who have any bone health issues in SMA, these are the people that are getting the infusions, particularly that you speak to those doctors who arrange those infusions. So those are usually endocrinologists, that you speak to them before you use vibrating plates. Because as I say, they can be quite intense, and I do think we need to be aware of what we are doing before we get on them. As I say, there are a couple of studies that show them to be beneficial, but they will only improve power if you are working with them, not if you just sit there like massage machines and many of the other things. They will not work on their own. Anything else, Marnie?
Yeah, we've got a few coming through. I have SMA type 3. I'm losing my ability to move while standing up. What do you think of EMS suits?
Okay, now there are many types of robotic suits, upright suits. I'm assuming EMS is something electrical. They are extremely expensive. They are cumbersome to wear. It's not something you'd go out in the street in. They are hard work to put on. And yes, they will give you exercise, but there are a lot of machines and other ways of exercising that may help. If you are still ambulant, or if you are eligible for any of the treatments, intensive physio along with these treatments, Spinraza, unfortunately we know Risdiplam has not been approved for type 3 yet. I am absolutely finished about the way type 3s have been treated with all these treatments, but that's besides the point. I think that the suits are a very short-term option. I really have never met anyone, and I know about the suits because I've worked with the suits in the past, that people tend to find them a bit of a novelty. It's a great idea, and it would be wonderful if it was just like putting on a load of lycra and being able to get up and wander around. But to be honest, they're much more cumbersome than that. They're much more difficult to get on and off. They really need quite a lot of controlling to get it right. And my feeling is, well, if you could try it, I'm not even sure that it's being trialed that extensively in the UK. If you can try it and it works for you, great, but I'm not convinced it's a long-term solution. I think there are other options at the moment, exercise machines, physio, electrical stimulation without the suit, that could be a possible option. But if you have the opportunity to try a suit, give it a go and see if it'll work for you. At the moment, I am not convinced, and I'm hoping, because as I say, I have worked with these suits, that ultimately what you will have at some point is what ends up as just almost like a lycra bodysuit, you know, something you'll see on The Incredibles or something. It's a nice stretchy lycra suit that has all the electrical pads in that will help you get going. But at the moment, they're a bit more cumbersome and hard work than a lycra suit.
Okay, we've got another one asking, well, there seems to be an age where children stop standing. What equipment do you recommend to follow this through their whole life?
The reason that most children stop standing is because their contractures get too bad or they no longer want to do it. A child at secondary school does not usually want to stand in the classroom. It's different when you're in primary school, when all the other children are standing up, when you can put your hands in the water tray or the sand tray along with everybody else, when you can get easily into a standing frame. And if you go back to the last talk on equipment, there was an awful lot about standing frames in there. I think if somebody wants to continue standing, and we have just in the last 2 months arranged for a young man with a boy, very good type 2 SMA, who has stood all the way through until he's, I think, 14 years old, who still wants to stand. It's not a common option and it's not feasible for most, but he has gone down the route of a standing wheelchair and he is really happy with that because he wants to continue standing. But he is a rarity. There are not many 14 and 15-year-old type 2s who want to continue standing. The people who seem to want to continue standing most are the type 3s who are struggling. But one of the problems, apart from contractures, which really is a great barrier to standing, is spinal surgery. And sometimes it just becomes too difficult by the time you've had spinal surgery. A lot of surgeons, if you have a fixed spine, not if you have growing rods, but if you have a fixed spine, most surgeons are happy to let you stand reasonably quickly after surgery. But again, once you've had spinal surgery, very often your hips and knees get tight quickly because you're not doing an awful lot of activity. But if you want to continue standing, there are standing frames up to adulthood. We talked in the other talk about standing slings. We've talked about standing wheelchairs. So there are options to continue standing into adulthood. I know one young lady, she's a lot younger than me, in her early 40s, who suddenly decided out of the blue she wanted to start standing again and managed it with the aid of standing slings. Now, it's not perfect. She's got quite marked contractures, but she said just feeling the weight through her feet and be able to kick her legs and do some work was really, really pleasant for her, and she really enjoyed it. Whether she's kept it up, I don't know, but it is something that's quite easy to achieve if you have certainly if you have a ceiling track hoist. It's quite a nice way of standing if you get a standing sling. Marnie, any more?
Yeah, we've got a few more. My son's seating is not wide enough and his left leg is hanging off the cushion, causing hip pain. can I use anything to ease his pain temporarily while seating gets sorted?
That's really difficult if it's not wide enough, but abduction blocks, if you try and block the legs, because very often when they're falling out, what you need is a block. If you can get some chip foam or some high density foam, not squishy foam, and this is why I say chip foam, and saying chip foam, I think HomeSense, not HomeSense, Dunelm. If you have a Dunelm in your area, I know Dunelm that I used to go to sell blocks of chip foam. If you get a block of chip foam and put it in the side of the wheelchair to try and hold that leg in a better position, something like that may work. You may have some sort of other block. If you do yoga or Pilates, you might have one of the blocks that you sit on or rest your head on in a block. You may try that down the side. A towel or something that squashes is going to be too soft. But chip foam, you can cut to size. It's comfortable because if he leans against the chip foam, it's not uncomfortable like something more solid, not too squishy like a towel. And it may be worth trying a block of chip foam. You can make it narrower to try and keep the leg in midline and stop it hanging over. If that doesn't work, it may be that what you need to do is actually, and this will not be a popular solution, is actually tie his legs together. You don't have to do it very obviously, but even a belt across, something that doesn't look very obvious, but a belt across his lap, not too close to his hips, but actually across the thighs to actually bring the legs together, can work. Now, I know that would, again, for some people not be a popular option, but if he's getting hip pain, it could be a good solution. And I know one young man who actually spent his whole teenage with his legs tied together to stop them flopping out. And he was more worried about his hips and his pain than he was about what people thought about him. So he really didn't mind that he was wearing a belt around his thighs, as I say, for most of his teenage. So it really has to be a solution that works for everyone, but it's may not be insolvable with something simple, at least until wheelchair services can get it sorted out.
Okay, we've got another one. Is there something less bulky than CAFOs that adults can wear to help fit in dainty shoes?
CAFOs won't help you fit in dainty shoes. Marnie, you know all about dainty shoes, and there's a couple of other young ladies I could mention who can get into dainty shoes. The problem with shoes is not tightness of the ankle. If you, well, it is for boys, but if you are a lady or a girl or a teenager and you want to wear dainty shoes, pointing your feet down, just go to New Look and get a nice pair of high heels, and then you can get dainty shoes with high heels and nobody will notice that you've got pointy down feet. And I know there's more than one young lady I know with SMA who gets lots of shoes from New Look with great high heels and they look amazing in a wheelchair. The problem becomes when your heel is then twisted. It's nothing to do with your foot pointing down. Dainty shoes can point down in the same way that you can point your toes in dainty shoes, you can get them on. The problem becomes when your heel twists or your foot twists. Now, people tend to think of the foot as just the ankle joint with this shovel bit on the bottom, and a foot is much, much, much more complex than that. The foot is one of the most complex mechanical parts of the body, and the foot is really, the ankle joint is one of the least important parts of the body. It's great for walking, but for standing and movement, actually there are many more important joints, and the most important joint is the one under the ankle, the subtalar joint, and we've talked about this before, and that directs the heel in and out. And what often makes getting shoes impossible is the tightness of the heel. If the heel is twisted, which it so often is, then it is very difficult to get shoes on. And if you don't want to wear splints, and splints actually are very, very rarely can correct a heel position, then I'm afraid your only option is surgery. If you have a very twisted foot, you are not going to get dainty shoes on. If that is what you want, that is a justifiable reason for finding a surgeon who can do your feet.
Okay. I have seen some rods bend while after surgery. Do you encourage a brace after surgery?
That is not something that I can say. That has to be decided by the spinal surgeon who did your spine. Many of the children who get the growing rods, their spinal surgeon will say they still want them to wear a brace to protect them. These rods are flexible up to a point, and the surgeons obviously are going to worry that if there is too much flexibility that the rods can break or become dislodged. But that is not my decision. I will go by the spinal surgeon who does the spinal surgery. We have at least 4 different spinal surgeons at Great Ormond Street who all work with the SMA children, and each one will have a different regime and a different idea. So unfortunately, there is no one choice of whether you do or do not wear a spinal jacket with spinal rods. If you have final fixation, if you have non-growing rods, then no, you should not need to wear a spinal jacket. But with growing rods, with magic rods, with magnetic rods, twisty rods, whatever, then that is a decision for the spinal surgeon. It is not something I would even comment about.
I'll just mention as well, I hope you don't mind, Marion, it could actually be pelvises that are tilting rather than rods bending as well. So if you look at me, after my spinal surgery, I was dead straight. But now it looks like I've got a bend, but it's not actually, my spine is still straight. It's my pelvis that is tilted, which gives me an effect of a bent spine. So it may be that you need to support the pelvis a bit more as well, just to prevent that happening.
With growing rods, they don't go into the pelvis. That is one thing. With growing rods, they do not go into the pelvis. So as Marnie says, it could well be that it's the gap between the spine and the pelvis. If the pelvis is tipping, then that's going to obviously look as though the spine is going one way. So that a good seat with a good cushion, with good assessment and good review, because again, as we talked about last time, one of the big problems with seating, and particularly wheelchair seating, which is part of mobility as well, is that nobody checks your cushion. They give you a cushion and 3 years later you're sitting on the same cushion, whether you've grown or changed or your contractures are different or you've had spinal surgery. So it's so important to make sure that the base you're sitting on is right, because you are sitting often all day in the same seat. You need to be both comfortable and functional, but you also need to be in a jolly good position.
Okay. We've got another one which is perhaps more of a request type thing than a question. But yeah, saying it's good if a video could be made to go into schools to provoke thoughts about the equipment if there isn't already one. So I don't know if you know if there is one.
I don't know of any videos about equipment for schools. I think that it is a good idea. I know I have talked to Lucy and Marnie about making videos on different topics. It's something we've talked about. COVID has prevented us doing any of these things. But I think, Marnie, that's something we need to tuck away in our little thing that says to do, and to go on the list of things to do when we get the opportunity to come out of lockdown. Now, one of the problems with doing a video about equipment is that we would want to be able to present equipment in the school situation. It may be that the way we do this is to go to one of the amazing special schools like Trelaw or Valence, or maybe some of you can suggest schools, and we go into a school and we look at the setup there and we take that back to mainstream schools, because very often they have the equipment and the ideas that mainstream schools don't know about. So I know we have a fab resource in our team. We have one of our physios, Nicola, worked at Valence School for many, many years. So every time we have a problem with schools, she will know of a piece of equipment that exists. Because as I say, the special schools, the Trelaws of the world, the Valences of the world, the Lonsdales of the world, very often have a much, much better idea of what's going on. some of the OTs have very, very good ideas, but if they haven't worked in special schools, they may not have seen everything. One of the problems we have with funding is that very often people will get a supplier and say, well, that's who we buy from, and that is it. And it doesn't quite work like that. So I think it's a lovely idea. I think we need to put that alongside stretches and exercise and a few other videos we've talked about doing, to look at equipment, to look at school equipment. But I do think we need to go to a school, go through all the classes. Marnie and I were just talking before we came on live about a young man who's gone to a school where the school have never had children in wheelchairs before. This young man can walk, even though he has a wheelchair, and they don't want him to do cookery and science because they're worried about splashes. And obviously special schools have special aprons, and I'm sure many other children have those leather style aprons or the protective aprons that will stop them getting splashed in cookery or science. And I really feel that the schools just don't know what equipment is out there, and that's one of the problems. The OT, unfortunately, he's just transitioned to secondary school now, so there has been a limit to what OTs can do in schools, but it obviously is something that school have no concept about, is any equipment that he can use in labs and in cookery. And there, I'm sure there's lots of other equipment that they can make use of that they just don't know about. So yes, it is something we could do for the future. Again, we could ask the DLF what sort of things they recommend, but again, it's very often the disability advisors for that education authority who should know about equipment, and I don't think all of them do. They know about teaching, they know about learning, they know about education, but they don't always know how to best manage children who have extra needs.
Okay, thank you. And I think that is definitely something we'll put on our to-do
list.
Yeah. That's it for questions for now.
Good, because I was just going to say, I think we need to move on to mobility, otherwise we'll be doing this over another couple of weeks. I really want to talk about mobility. I think I am a complete and utter devotee of the idea that humans are mobile creatures. Now, I know that that is difficult when you are confined for your mobility to a wheelchair, but that is still a moving creature. You can still use your electric wheelchair to get from A to B. To me, there is nothing more negative, more soul-destroying, more unacceptable than a child who has no independent mobility, who is wheeled around everywhere in a buggy, who has a manual wheelchair they can't push. To me, this is completely and utterly unacceptable. Life is about moving, and if you have to do it on 4 wheels, that is absolutely fine, but you need those 4 wheels to do it, and that is fine too. So if we go down to the very, very basic, the idea of little children, and there is one thing that I will say about mobility that I'll say it once, because otherwise I'm going to get shot, and I know I very often do, but I truly think that wheelchair services can be some of the most difficult services in the country to deal with. In my 30 plus years, I think I've had more arguments with wheelchair services than absolutely anybody else in the world, and I've had plenty of arguments. And I think it's really difficult, and I hate it when parents have to battle with wheelchair services, and there are ways around it which we will discuss. But I want to start from teeny and go all the way to adult. And children do not start moving in the normal situation until they're about 3 or 4 months when they're rolling. And you always know a parent of an SMA1 or even some of the early SMA2s when they change the nappy on the bed and they go off to put the nappy in the bin and the child is lying on the bed. Now, in the normal situation, no parent leaves a child over 3 months old lying on a bed when they've changed their nappy, unless they put them on the floor or pick them up, because the possibility is that child goes on the floor and splats themselves on the floor without help. So the first mobility a child will have is rolling. And we know there are children who can roll. And we know there are children who do get around at home still by rolling. And that is the first way of actually getting any mobility. And that is not a negative. And if you have a very weak child or a very young child, then encouraging rolling as a form of mobility is a positive. And if you've got a bigger child that needs to get from A to B, there's a toy over there that Fred wants, then always, and I will chastise parents over this, then you will go and get the toy for Fred, or Fred's little sister or big brother will go and get the toy for Fred. If Fred can lie himself down and roll and then sit up again when he's got what he's got, then he should be encouraged to roll, because every time you do something for them that they could do for themselves, you are taking away an opportunity to work, to exercise, to even stretch joints, because one of the beauties of rolling is it does stretch your hips. Do not take away opportunities to move. Do not take away opportunities to roll. It may seem basic. It may seem it's too babyish, but rolling is the prime way a person, a baby, an infant learns to move. Don't discourage it. Just because a child is 4 or 5, if they could get around by rolling where they can't get around any other way, then let them roll. It's not a problem. The next level of mobility is bottom shuffling or swiveling on your bottom. It's actually not that easy in SMA. Many children find when they're sitting, they can turn around, but they can't bottom shuffle. And very often you can't bottom shuffle because there is too much friction between your bottom and the surface you're on. Carpet is not a good place to bottom shuffle. And on the other hand, when you have a child that's at risk of falling over when they're sitting, carpet is your preference. You don't want a child who's going to be falling frequently to be on stone floors, on ceramic floors, or even on cushioned lino. So generally, carpets are not the easiest place to get around on your bottom. So encouraging bottom shuffling is great, but it needs to be a fairly slippery floor. Bottom shuffling backwards is very often easier than bottom shuffling forwards. But again, strangely enough, bottom shuffling backwards from a contractures and power point of view is actually better than bottom shuffling forwards, because when you're bottom shuffling backwards, you're using your extensor muscles, you're pushing your knees straight, you're pushing your hips straighter. When you're bottom shuffling forwards, everything's being pulled into flexion, and it's not as positive from a joint point of view. So if you can encourage backwards bottom shuffling, great, but if the surfaces are too difficult and there's too much friction, it won't happen. The next level of mobility is crawling, and we know that only a minority of children with type 2 crawl. It is certainly not many children who crawl, and yet with treatments we could probably see more and more children crawling. And again, it encourages a lot of positive things. Do not look at crawling as too babyish. If you have a 4, 5 or 6-year-old who can crawl, encourage it. If they are on the floor, they want a toy, they need to get something, they want to move to another place, crawling is a perfectly acceptable way of getting there. The beauty of crawling is it is one exercise that works the shoulders, it weight bears through the shoulders, it's good for the whole of the upper limbs, it's good for the shoulder blades. And very often when we're talking about exercise, we forget that the arms don't just lift up, there is a whole group of muscles and joints working around the shoulder blade, the collarbone, to actually stabilize the shoulders, to help stabilize the head and neck, to do an awful lot of work rather than just have them up by your ears. So crawling is excellent work for the shoulders and arms. So don't dismiss crawling as too babyish. Even if it's hard, it's better to be able to get from A to B by slow crawling than get somebody else to do it for you. So those are the levels of independent mobility that we can encourage that a child could possibly manage or can be encouraged to try and do themselves. If it's all too difficult, if you have a type 1 who can't roll, who can't sit, who certainly can't crawl, then we have to think about how we get them mobile. And without talking a lot about standing and calipers and things that we can put on their legs to help, we need to then start about thinking wheelchairs. And wheelchairs is a big, big subject because there's so many things to think about. Now, all babies will go in a buggy of sorts. Obviously, when you have a child with type 1, the buggy has to have a lot of equipment on it. You can often get special buggies that have shelves and all sorts of things to put the BiPAP, to put the cough assist, to put the suction, and your whole array of equipment needs to go on the buggy with you. And once you start thinking about wheelchairs, it's actually quite difficult to get all this equipment on a wheelchair, let alone in a buggy. So there are considerations for the equipment that has to go with it. So that it's not only about the actual machine itself, it's what needs to go with that. A child who cannot sit is a big seating problem. And in terms of mobility, we want children to sit. We want to make sure that every child has the opportunity, where possible, for some independent mobility. And the weaker children are only ever going to get that in an electric wheelchair. If they are in a buggy, if they are in a reclined buggy, then the possibility of being able to take yourself from A to B, even if that is only 3 meters, it becomes impossible. So it's really, really important that type 1 children do, over time, get encouraged slowly, bit by bit, to come to a functional sitting position and manage their breathing. And these days, there are very, very few children, certainly in the UK, who cannot be sat for even short periods of time. So it's really important, and if there's any physiotherapists listening, it is a big goal to get the children sitting. Being reclined does not give you a view of the world, does not allow you to see what's going on around you, and does not give you mobility. Then we have to think about the children who are in buggies. Buggies have a big place in the home in mobility. They get a child from A to B. They may be great if you have an older or younger sibling who also needs to be with you. But ultimately, you will never, ever be independent in a buggy, and you need a wheelchair as soon as you can sit in a good position. Many, many parents are reluctant to get that first wheelchair. It is a big ask to say to parents, your child needs a wheelchair, you need to get a wheelchair, because what you are saying is your child cannot walk. And they don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear the child is not going to walk. They don't want to hear their child cannot walk. And a lot of parents take time to get round to the idea that a wheelchair is better than a buggy. When you are 2 years old and you're sitting in a buggy, you are a 2-year-old sitting in a buggy. When you are a 2-year-old sitting in a cute, however fabulous looking little wheelchair, when you're 2 and sitting in your bright pink shiny wheelchair or your black go faster wheelchair, you are a disabled child. And parents find that very hard. It is not something that many people want to accept straight away. But if we are going to get children mobile, they need to be sitting in something that holds them in a good position, that allows them even the tiniest bit of independent mobility if they can push, and that gives them upright sitting so they can see the world around them. Buggies, as I say, have their place, but it is really, really important at whatever age your child stops using a buggy, that the most important thing people forget in the buggy is their posture in it. And if you have a normal buggy that you have bought yourself, however they're expensive, it can be Silver Cross, it can be Mama Baby, whatever, French, Greek, German, whoever, you need to be sitting well in it, because a lot of your posture will, or bad posture more to the point, will start from young. And so we need to make sure these buggies are holding the child in a good position, not only when they are awake, but also when they are asleep. So most children, like in car seats, when they are sitting in buggies and fall asleep, we need to make sure they're not all squashed up to one side. Because the problem is, if they are all squashed up to one side, it is very usual that every time they fall asleep, they will fall to the same side. So buggy inserts, making sure they are sitting well in the buggy is extremely important, because not only are we talking mobility, but while you are in that chair, it is also about posture. And it is really important, if you are going to be spending most of your day in a wheelchair, in a buggy, in a seat, that your posture is good in it. Ideally, children will have a buggy and a wheelchair. Now, there are wheelchair services who will not provide both a buggy and a wheelchair. It may be that parents have to fund one of them themselves. So obviously they want to fund the cheaper one, but then so do wheelchair services. When it comes to the first wheelchair, really the pattern of the wheelchair, what it looks like, irrespective of colour and jazziness, is dependent very much on head control. If your child has a weak head that's going to flop, you are going to need something more supportive, something bigger, something with a headrest. But why we want wheelchairs is that very often they are more supportive, but if the child has any possibility to push themselves, then they should be given the opportunity to try. Again, by pushing them in something all the time, we are taking away opportunity to exercise, to strengthen their arms, to do something useful. And if we go back to what we were talking about last time about standing, that my absolute favourite standing frame is a dynamic stander for those children who have the arm power to push it. Even if they can only push it 1 metre, that is more work than they are doing otherwise. I recently assessed a young man with type 2 for, I think it was his 5th Spinraza injection. So this was actually an assessment that would be going back to NICE. And one of the items on the EK scale is, can you push your wheelchair 10 metres? To which father said no. Now, this young man's about 9 or 10, and I wasn't taking no for an answer. So we took him out of the room and we put him in the corridor and we made him push himself 10 metres. And what a surprise, he could do it. It was hard, it was a lot of work. But because he'd never been expected to do it, he'd never tried, he didn't know. As soon as he wanted to move anywhere, Daddy move me, Mummy move me, somebody push me, and they did. And it's really important that these children with type 2 or non-ambulant type 3 are given every possible opportunity to push themselves in manual wheelchairs. It is important that if they can push, that the wheelchair is light, it is lightweight, and has what is known as sports style or angled wheels. You will find wheelchair services will tell you they do not do them. There is no excuse. They do not cost more than a heavier, non-angled wheelchair. So wheelchair services have no real excuse for saying your child cannot have a lightweight, because they need to push the least possible weight, a lightweight sports style manual wheelchair. And the angled wheels, they're not, if you've ever seen wheelchair basketball, they're almost flat, but these are angled and they are much, much easier to push than a standard upright wheeled wheelchair, which is generally heavier, but the wheels are much harder to push. There is no excuse for not having these jazzier sports style chairs that the children can push. So that every child who has a manual wheelchair, we have to think about several things. We have to think about the foot plate. Let's start at the bottom. There are bars and there are individual foot plates. Bars are not as easy to manage as individual foot plates. If you are given the choice of a bar or two foot plates, take the foot plates. Transfers are much, much better when you can put feet on the ground. If the child goes into calipers, a bar is almost impossible to negotiate. And a foot plate that swings away allows the child to get closer often to equipment and to surfaces. So if we start right at the beginning with the foot plates, then we are better off with 2 foot plates than a bar. The wheels we have already talked about. Some wheels are fixed and will not come off, or you can have the removable wheels. It really doesn't matter. My preference is the angled wheels, and these are easier to push. There are pushing gloves around. I know that a lot of people will say you cannot get pushing gloves, but if you cannot find little gloves, if the children push their wheelchair outside or push their wheelchair where it's going to get dirty and they're going to get dirty hands, because they do have this horrible habit of pushing the actual wheels rather than pushing the bars on the outside of the wheels, which is where they're meant to push. So if they're going to need pushing gloves, go into a sports shop and get the cycling gloves. And there's plenty of teeny weeny sizes of cycling gloves that will do equally well to pushing gloves. So children who are using their wheelchairs quite a lot and pushing themselves ideally would have pushing gloves. The seat is all important. What you will get on some of the sports style wheelchair is no arms, no armrests. But what you should at least get is clothes guards. Now, an armrest, and the reason why a lot of these more sporty chairs do not have armrests is you have to lift your arms out further to get round the armrest. If there's no armrest, it is again easier to push the chair. So that there are some of the sports style chairs that do not have armrests. Some are an option and you can add them on, but you should always, as I say, have those little triangular sections at the sides that are called clothes guards to stop cardigans, sweatshirts, tops, even straps that haven't been done up, even though they should have been, getting caught in the wheels. So there should always be a clothes guard, even if there are no armrests. Now, having no armrest is not really a problem because the children don't tend to sit there with their arms on a manual wheelchair in the way you would be on an electric wheelchair when you're driving. So having no armrest is not an issue, because an armrest is what it says, it's an armrest. It's not supposed to stop you leaning to one side or another. That is not the function of an armrest. So having no armrest, if your child is falling to the side and you think an armrest is safer, then you have to think, how am I going to stop my child falling to the side? But the vast majority of wheelchairs do have armrests. As I say, some of the type 3s who are much more secure in their body do certainly not need armrests. And we have got some type 3 children who've got the sportier chairs for longer distances who do not need the armrests. The armrests, it's really important if you've got them that they are adjustable in height, that they are not fixed and solid. They should be able to be adjusted up and down, because as a child grows, you may want them lower. The one thing they shouldn't be doing is leaning to one side. The armrests should ideally be adjustable. They should also come out, because if you are not hoisting, they make sliding board transfers easier, and they make transfers easier if they come out, particularly, say, in the winter time when you have a thick coat on and you need the space inside. It's sometimes easier to tuck everything down an armrest that comes out. The back needs to be high enough without the handles digging in the back of the shoulders. So that height of the back. Now, in adult sports wheelchairs, there is a very low back on a lot of them, and those are proper sports wheelchairs. No small child should have those very low backs on their wheelchair. They're very much more for paraplegics who have very good upper trunk and arm power, and no child should have a very low backrest. The backrest should be high enough, but as I say, it really does need that. No child should be sitting back and saying, oh, those armrests are sort of digging in my back. The pushing bars. Now, the bars really do need to be the right height. Far too many children with small wheelchairs have tiny little handles this big, which is absolutely no use to parents at all. You are not doing anybody any favors by constantly hunching over the chair to be able to push your child. And wheelchair services must be taken to task if they refuse to give you long enough handles so that you can safely push the chair. And another thing people forget about, and I'm not going to spend hours on seating because we've talked about seating in other talks, this is very much about the chair. The other thing that we need is tipping bars. Now, tipping bars are the two bars at the back, and very often you get the chair and what you find is the tipping bars will flip upwards. They're usually on clips, and somebody's flipped them upwards, so they're poking upwards. Now, tipping bars are not just about the wheelchair tipping back and you not falling out. Tipping bars are also about getting up and down curbs, getting over a bump. And I was pushing a child in a wheelchair recently, and there was a tiny bump I wanted to get over with a tipping bar, and there wasn't. So when you put your foot on the tipping bar, it helps you to tip, to go up over curbs, up over bumps. And ideally, if you are pushing a wheelchair, you should always have these little bars at the back under the seat for you to put your foot on to help you get up and over bumps. As I say, they're not just about making sure the wheelchair doesn't tip over backwards. They're to help you tip the wheelchair to get them up and down. There is not very much more that you will get on a manual wheelchair that you don't add yourself. Marnie, any questions?
Yes, we've got a couple. Our first one is about wheelchair use in school. That the school do not want the child to use an electric wheelchair due to worries of them hurting other children. However, the parents are not happy with this because it means they've got no independence during school time. Have you got any advice?
Somebody needs to do a risk assessment. It really depends on the age of the child. We have children in whizzy bugs in nurseries where there are no issues with other children being run over. To be honest, I think all of us have had our toes run over. But then I think there's a lot of people watching who say, well, that was probably deliberate because children like to run over the toes of physiotherapists. But on the whole, and let's get real about this, there are very rarely accidents where a child will drive over another child because, and we know this, and this is specific to SMA, You can have a child who has never ever had any independent mobility, even as young as 2 years old. And as I say, we have a child at the moment in a Wizzy Bug in the hospital who got his first Wizzy Bug at 2. And the minute you put them in, they can drive them. They could go through obstacles. They can negotiate doors. Children with SMA have a very, very amazing sense of space and spatial awareness. And they do not often run over other children. The problem we have is other children not being controlled. And so this becomes a school issue, because it's not a case of the child in the wheelchair being unsafe. It's a case of the other children not being used to the idea that this child can move faster than them and to get out of the way. And the only way this is going to improve is with education, with the other children getting used to the idea of having an electric wheelchair around. The kids with SMA in wheelchairs as young as 2 and 3 years old are very, very good at negotiating obstacles, including other children. But it's the other children that need to be aware of an electric wheelchair. And if it was so unsafe, we'd have brothers and sisters being squished daily, and we don't. I can understand the school's concerns, but they have to deal with it, not just say you can't do it. To actually say you can't do it is probably against the Disability Discrimination Act or one of the Accessibility Acts, because you are not allowing that child to access their environment as their peers do. And that has got to come under disability discrimination. So the school must make the effort to make the other children aware. And with COVID, where you're in bubbles, this should be much, much easier, where the groups are smaller, to educate the other children into being around an electric wheelchair. This is not an issue of the child in the wheelchair. This is an issue of the other children around them. And therefore, the school have an obligation to make sure that they are safe, that there is space, that the child may have the speed limited, but that other children become wheelchair aware. And this is part of integration, not only for the child in the wheelchair, but for all children to understand there are children who need to be around in electric wheelchairs and to get used to it. This is life. This is what we're about. We're about integration. If they've accepted a non-ambulant child in the school, they have to accept all the equipment that goes with them. And an electric wheelchair is an essential part of their life, their learning, and their exploring their environment. They should be allowed to explore their environment in exactly the way other children do, and that is by moving. You cannot explore when you stand still. And on that basis, school have got to get a handle on this and educate the other children, is my feeling. Admittedly, it's got to be done sensitively, it's got to be done sensibly, and it's got to be done with a risk assessment. But to say no blanket outright is not acceptable from a discrimination point of view would be my feeling. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that yourself, Marnie.
I'd say kids would quickly learn to not get their feet onto the wheel, but that's probably not a good bit of advice. I think
that is the issue, though, that it's up to the school to teach the other kids rather than the child in the wheelchair, because the child in the wheelchair, the child we are talking about, and so many other children. And I think if you speak to other parents, you will find out that the school are being extra overcautious, because accidents don't happen if the school are sensible. Yeah,
and I think I just couldn't imagine being in the classroom and not being able to move when I wanted to move.
Like, well, I think that's a right that all children have, and I think that should be put to the school. This is the child's right to access their environment, and on that issue, that the school need to rethink how they introduce that mobility into the school.
Yeah, I agree.
Right, let's move on to electric wheelchairs, because there are several aspects of electric wheelchair we need to consider. The first one is getting one. Now, many parents of young type 2s, type 1s, the better type 1s particularly, are getting electric wheelchairs as soon as they can. And we know that there are 1,000,001 whizzy bugs around and mini salsas and all sorts of things that the children are learning to use quickly and are perfectly good wheelchairs. But when it comes to going to school, when a child is about 5 years old, possibly a little bit older, we need to think of a little bit more sophistication than a wheezy bug. We need to think about function. We need to think about the classroom. We need to think about the home. We need to think that this wheelchair is their legs. This wheelchair is their mobility. This wheelchair helps them to get through life on a daily basis. And there are some features that are extremely important. The first thing is that obviously it's got to be good. It's got to be well, easy to maintain. Big problem with parents is the number of wheels you get through, the number of problems that some of these electric wheelchairs do have. We need to think about where the joystick is. One of the questions that came up last time when we were talking about mobility, even though we weren't talking about electric wheelchairs, is having the joystick in a place where you could have your arm extended. And that seems crazy to me. We don't drive in a car with our arms extended. It's in a comfortable mid position, and that's where the joystick should be. But you have to think firstly about sustainability. Can some of the weaker kids actually manage a normal joystick? Do they need adaptations to the joystick? Do they need something totally different from a joystick? Do their arms fall off the armrest? Are the armrests too narrow? Does the joystick need to be on one side or the other? Does having a joystick on one side cause scoliosis? No, we don't believe it does. But we need to make sure that the child's not always leaning on the side of the joystick. So the joystick position and the joystick itself and how easy it is to move obviously has to be a consideration. And that's something that the child can decide better than anybody else. So there's no point in a wheelchair company or mommy or daddy telling the child what they need. The best person to decide what a child needs in terms of a joystick is the child themselves. And if they can't manage a joystick, there are other things out there. And this is particularly true for some of the weaker adults and even some of the weaker children. I had many, many years ago, and he may well be out there listening, our first ever young man who transitioned to adult services as a type 1. He never sat. Admittedly, he was a very good type 1, but he never sat. He must have transitioned to adult, so he must be about 21 now. And he had built for him on his table, he had a ball system. And with both hands, he could manage the ball for forwards, for backwards, and side to side. And it worked brilliantly well. And he was able to do this with two hands. And there are engineering companies out there. There are special, Meru is one of them, which is the Medical Engineering Rehabilitation Unit. Bath have a biomechanical engineering unit, Bath University, who do this sort of thing. And if you need specialist adapted equipment, it is out there. Do not be fobbed off that you can't have it, or wheelchair services don't do it, or it doesn't come on that particular wheelchair. There are quite a lot of adaptations and engineering companies who can help you to get the joystick you need. The next thing that I want to talk about, because to me it's an essential, it's more than essential for secondary school, but certainly once you start getting to junior school, 7 or 8 years old, I honestly feel that all the children with SMA who have electric wheelchairs should have a rising seat. Now, I know many parents have said that they have to pay for that as an extra, and my belief is it should be a standard feature on electric wheelchairs for children with SMA for many, many reasons. It increases their reach. It increases their world. They can see things that other kids can see. They can get up to surfaces they wouldn't otherwise get to. They can be included in face-to-face conversations and not always feel that they're down here and everybody else is up there. And with adults, to me, it's even more essential, because if you're at the bar, you don't want to be the only person sitting down. You want to be face-to-face with the rest of the world. And to me, a rising seat is an essential part of a wheelchair. That's all very well, but let's look at how difficult wheelchair services can be. But there's some considerations with a rising seat. If you are sitting higher, you are therefore going to be less stable. And if the chair is less stable, to make it stable, it has to have a heavier base. So you need to think carefully, both when getting an electric wheelchair that has a raising seat, the size of the chair, how you're going to transport it. If you do not have a car that it will go into, how is the child going to take it to school? Are they going to get school transport? Can you get it in and out of the house? You cannot lift an electric wheelchair up steps. It is not possible, and not one with a raising lowering seat, because as I said, it has to be heavier than a standard electric wheelchair to give it the increased stability, the heavier base it needs, not to tip once you are on rise. So you need to think that this is not simple in terms of mobility, in terms of getting it into a vehicle. You have to have an adapted vehicle. You have to make sure your house is accessible. And wheelchair services will not give you one if you cannot get it into the house, unless there is a guarantee it can be kept at school. And that basis, we did have kids who basically didn't have their electric wheelchair for the whole of lockdown. That's not acceptable either. So how do we deal with wheelchair services? Well, we have a very easy way of dealing with wheelchair services. We talk about discrimination in a very, very covert and clever way. We talk about them being allowed to explore their environment as their peers do. We talk about them being able to access as their peers do. We talk about the children having every opportunity in life to socialize as well as educate as their peers do. And what we are suggesting with that is, if you do not give us something, you are discriminating against this child. It doesn't work with everyone. In fact, in some wheelchair services, they will fight even giving you an electric wheelchair. And this is very true of some of the struggling type 3s. What do we do with some of the struggling type 3s who really can't walk that far, but can't push that far either? For them, we have another tactic, and that is the tactic of, okay, let them fall over and break a leg, and then they can't walk, and then you'll have to give them an electric wheelchair. And while that sounds very blunt, we don't exactly write it like that, but we have to explain that they are being put at risk when they are walking outdoors by slippery pavements, by winds, by obstacles, by curbs, by many other things, that if they are then unable to walk outside, they are being restricted, they are being limited in their life opportunities, they are not being allowed not only to explore their environment, but to move around at school or in the workplace or socially. And so we will push and push wheelchair services into this sort of thing, as we believe it is a right for all these children. As I say, type 3 who are struggling are more difficult, but we have had wheelchairs for type 3s. Now, the other thing that we push for a lot with some of the type 3s, if they're not going to have an electric wheelchair, is the e-motion wheels. Now, there are other adaptations. The e-motion wheels are not the only way of making a manual wheelchair electric. I particularly like the e-motion wheels. I think it's a very clever idea. And it does mean the child is still doing some of the work and pushing, whereas some of the other ideas, you have a joystick that will allow a manual wheelchair to become electric. There is the one that has that sort of bike front at the front that clips on and you drive it almost like an electric trike. I don't particularly like that one. I think it gets in the way. I've heard of a few accidents with those because the wheel at the front can make the manual wheelchair a little bit unstable. There are bars that go on at the back. you have to have a big enough wheelchair. So you can't be very small to get the emotion wheels, because the emotion wheels will only go on standard size wheelchairs. The bar that goes across the back has to have a particular width, minimum width that it fits on. I'm not sure what it is, but the gap between the wheels has minimum, it must be at least 30 centimeters, but it's probably more, because 30 centimeters is only about that, and most, even the diddly wheelchairs will be that. And of course, some of them are very, very portable and some of them are not. So it really is quite dependent on the individual. But if the emotion wheels cost around £4,500 and an electric wheelchair would cost £7,000, then the wheelchair services can't justify not giving you emotion wheels if they're not going to give you an electric wheelchair. Now, the final thing that I'm going to say, because we've just got time for a few more questions, is that if you are really struggling with your wheelchair services, then you need to contact your CCG, your commissioning group. This is the body who holds the funds for your health service, your district health service where you live. So they will fund all the GPs in your area, they will fund primary care in your area, they will often be the funders of the wheelchair services. And we have had several children who have successfully gone to the CCG, or parents have gone to CCG to complain that wheelchair services are refused on no reasonable grounds, a wheelchair or a particular type of wheelchair that will be best for that child. Admittedly, we do usually send supporting letters, and your physio can, or OT, or both can do this, even your consultant. And the CCGs are usually quite successful at ringing the wheelchair service and said, well, we've given you £7,000 for this child to have a wheelchair, or they are entitled to a £7,000 wheelchair. Why are you saying that £4,500 emotion wheels aren't suitable? So a CCG, and you look them up under your local health authority, you will find they have a number usually, they have a website, they have an email address to contact them. Go and complain to them. We've just sent another family off to the CCG to complain that they're not getting any physio at all. Their physio's gone on maternity leave and they're not being replaced, so tough you're not getting physio, which is ludicrous. And go to CCG, because if they have funded something that you're not getting, they will want to know why. Marnie, questions? We're running out of time again.
We've got a couple, and this one actually links to what you have just said regarding maternity leave, is that their OT is going on maternity leave and they're not bringing in a temporary one during this leave. What can they do?
Complain to the CCG. So go to the CCG, because the CCG will be paying for an OT and they probably are unaware. Now, admittedly, you cannot have your OT until the maternity pay stops. They can't always replace somebody until after their maternity pay. So as many weeks as that is, and I think that's about 12 weeks of statutory. But then complain to the CCG, because if they're paying or not paying for a replacement for an essential service, then they should be. Very often the CCG are unaware of where their money is going or where it's being badly spent. But if they're not doing it, I mean, you can complain directly to the head of OT or the head of therapy services. But if you really want to go straight to the top, then go to the CCG and say, where's the OT? Why are they not replacing them? Where is your funding for that OT now going? But there are problems with maternity pay and getting locums or agency, that very often with maternity leave, you cannot employ a locum until they've finished paying the maternity pay, and that's a problem. But, you know, it's very, very hard to accept to be neglected just because they are not prepared to put somebody in place. I mean, my feeling is I would personally go straight to the head of OT or therapy services, and if I get no joy from them, at least I can then go to the CCG and say, well, I've tried to go to the head OT, I've tried to go to the head of therapy services, and nobody can give me a satisfactory answer as to why my child is not getting the occupational therapy services that I am sure you are funding. and that should get them mobilised.
Okay, we've got one on your opinion on crawlers for a fairly strong type 1 who is far away from crawling on their own but has just enough head support to hold their head up in that position, or when lying on a skateboard and pushing themselves with their arms.
Absolutely. We used to put tons of kids on crawling boards. They weren't called crawling boards, they were called I can't remember what we used to call them. They weren't called that. But yes, I mean, it was very, very common to actually put children on these, what in effect were big skateboards. And every single physio department I know had these boards where you put the child on their tummy, you strap them across their bottom, and off they went, zooming off by pulling along on their arms. And that is great. And I have absolutely no issue with them. I also have no problem with those little buggies that go on the floor with the 2 wheels that are almost like a little floor wheelchair where you can get around by pushing on your arms in sitting. They are available. I don't know who makes them. That is something I need to have a look at, but that is something else that they can do. But I agree, if your child has type 1 and has the head control not to scrape along on their nose across the floor, absolutely give it a go. Or get a couple of skateboards together, tie them together. Although skateboards are pretty high, and those boards, not only are they tend to be lower, but they also tend to have swivel wheels, which allows you to turn, which a skateboard doesn't.
Okay, they're just further asking, what should they look for, as in pay attention to, when buying a piece of equipment like this or even building it themselves?
Really just to make sure that the child, firstly, if they're a type 1, that when they're on their front, that there's plenty of room to breathe, that you may want to pad across the chest and just give them some breathing room, that the feet, ideally, it may be, if you're going to make it yourself, make it adjustable. Ideally, when the child is lying down, that their feet are actually over the end. And the reason for that is to keep the hips and knees straight. If their feet are on it and their legs are all twisted out, you are better with your feet hanging over the edge. So you don't want your toes scraping across the floor. So that, again, needs to be high enough. But ideally, your feet are over the end, not your whole leg, but at least your feet are over the end, because it will put your bottom, your knees and your ankles in a better position.
Okay, and I'm going to do this as the last question and then let you get off to the rest of what's left of the evening. Is wheelchair services have provided a chair. Their child doesn't like it, can't sit in it, isn't comfortable. The wheelchair services are adamant that the child just needs to get used to it, but the child is very uncomfortable and just does not want to sit in it at all. Any advice?
Okay, so you've been to wheelchair services and the person at wheelchair services is adamant because they're not prepared to find something else or to understand the problem. So what you need to do is get your physio or your OT to see the child in the chair at home and see what the problem is, and then they need to be the ones that are battling with wheelchair services. This is not something you can do yourself because you are battling with a professional who is head of wheelchair services. Now, some of those people who are in charge of wheelchair services are wheelchair experts as such, but that doesn't mean to say that they are pediatric experts. Some of them do not have a lot of pediatric experience, and that's what we often find in wheelchair services. They are OTs who've actually, until they got into wheelchair services and beyond, never saw a child in their life. They've only ever been an adult OT, and they do not know how to manage children in wheelchairs. So you need to get your local physio or your local OT involved in getting that piece of equipment changed, because again, you are wasting money and time putting a child in a chair that is not suitable for them. So your local OT and or physio should be getting involved to help you sort out why that child doesn't work, why that chair doesn't work for your child.
Okay, well, thank you, Marion. Another amazing webinar. I'm sure everyone's found it extremely helpful. If there's any questions that I've missed, I'll double check through the comments, I'll just pass them on to you, and then
Lovely, no problem.
yeah.
Okay, thanks a million, Marnie. Thanks for all your help. Take care, everyone. We may be going back into lockdown. Let's hope we're not. And we will find some topics that we either haven't touched on or touched on long ago and need to come back to. So we'll see you all soon. Thanks a million. Bye.
Bye.